So last week was fellowship.
Jesus Christ.
This week is forgiveness and salvation.
Hello and welcome to A God We Could Believe In, a frank and honest look at Christianity as we find it today. We're going to be looking at the things the church says and does that are embarrassing, confusing, or even downright offensive. In other religious contexts, your questions might be forbidden, but not here. So whether you're a lifelong churchgoer with the scars to prove it, or you've never entered a church and are just interested in the debate, this is a safe space for you. In that spirit, we're diving headlong into questions of sex and relationships, covering topics from marriage and purity to sexuality and masturbation. A quick content warning, today's episode is all about sexual abuse within the church and within relationships. Please look after yourselves. Today we're responding to your questions on our last episode, why do abusers thrive in church? Are there signs to look out for that a pastoral relationship has become abusive? And how should a community respond when allegations are made? I'm Tim Woodson, and today you've got biblical scholar Charlotte Naylor Davis, practical theologian Simon Hall, and taking the reins is poet, former social worker, and daughter of Simon, Rachel Hall.
Okay, well, some people may notice that we are without our MC today. We're down a man in the team. Tim is not here with us, so that means that I have to host. So apologies in advance. But
No, we're great. We're very happy, Rachel.
well, then you're welcome.
You know that you're the hostess with the mostest. Unfortunately, there's no food involved, so we don't need your partner to do the cooking.
I know. Well, what? Yeah, but what do I bring if I'm not bringing a partner that can cook food? I don't know. Anyway, me and Simon and Charlotte are here today to discuss the latest episode of the podcast, which was our episode on abuse in the church. I thought it'd be helpful to start by asking you guys how that's been for you since the episode came out and what interactions you might have had with people, whether that be in person or online, about the episode.
I've had quite a few people text and say, not very much, but that was really good, or that was really important, or we need to have this conversation more. As I said, I did a podcast a couple of years ago about this same thing, and the reaction then was the same of like, thank you, more people need to talk about this. Why don't we talk about it more? And I think there's a lot of people who've seen this happen and it comes out a lot. And then people just say, oh, well, it's that one guy who was bad, and then carry on. And actually, that bigger discussion of why does this happen? What do we do about it once it has happened has been really important to people. So that's been nice. It's nice that people are like, yes, let's do this.
I remember when we recorded this. This is like behind the curtain. We recorded the episode quite a while ago, which is why Soul Survivor kind of looms large in it, because it was still a big deal when we were talking about it. And I remember feeling very emotional while we recorded it. And for that reason, I shared it quite heavily on my socials, which I don't do for every podcast because I kind of feel like I don't want my socials to just end up being adverts for the podcast. But it got much more traction in terms of people actually responding and wanting to talk about it. And there were thanks and there were questions which will come up later. And I think particularly around the idea of like, which we did tease in the title of the podcast, which I don't know that we fully followed through on, which is church actually an enabling culture?
Yeah. Yes.
I think for me, surprisingly, I've had more conversations with people my age that were aware of things happening or had been abused when they were teenagers in church. And obviously I'm not at liberty to kind of discuss that at length, but, you know, that's been quite surprising for me, because I think it's not something that you expect to feel is close to you. And I think when it is, and as Dad said when we were making the episode, Soul Survivor, it kind of just happened. And that was a place that I loved and felt incredibly safe in. And other people that I know have kind of told me since the episode came out that they were abused at Soul Survivor, not by the same person, but that was something that had happened to them. So it's been pretty big on my end, really, just in terms of people feeling safe and comfortable to have those conversations with me since the episode's come out.
I think it's a really big thing to hear people talk about it, and then they say people come out and go, oh, actually I saw some of that, or I experienced parts of it, or now I look back, the things that we were involved in weren't safe. You know, that kind of, I think there's a lot of that happening at the moment with people. We start to have these conversations, and what happens is, like you say, either people feel safe to come and tell you something, or just those of us who are in those churches. I mean, this is definitely what happened with Soul Survivor, was that you start to reassess the church you were in and the culture you were in and wonder about it, right? And go, oh, actually, that was weird. You know, that was strange. Why did we do things that way? Why was that okay? Would we do it now? Which is a really good question. Like, you know, if we're 20 years on, Simon and I, 30 years on from running some youth things, would we do them the way we did them now? You know, what's the line there? Which I think does bring us into that kind of, how do you feel if you know that you've been part of a church that then was, you find out was run by someone who's abusive? Like you said, Soul Survivor was a really good place for you. What's it like to know that what was going on at the front isn't the whole picture or isn't as wholesome?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about it yesterday, and just that kind of concept of like, two things can be true at the same time. Like, I can say that I had a really great time and I made some really great friends and I felt very safe and I felt very free, and that was a really good environment for me. But that's a very individualistic point of view. And other people would say, and at the same time, it was unsafe for me and X, Y, and Z happened. And yeah, just talking about that concept of, you know, one truth doesn't negate the other, but holding both of those things can feel quite tricky. And we were talking about, like, I was with two people my age, and we were talking about, like, would we take our kids to church? And they were like, absolutely not. Like, because there's no way of knowing that that's not happening.
Wow.
And where you put your trust in church is pretty significant. And I think their feeling was, you know, particularly in smaller churches that, you know, are potentially struggling, like somebody could walk in and, you know, the next week be doing Sunday school and thinking about those processes of, like, we need to assess everybody that works with children, and do we do police checks on these people? And I think I talked about this in the episode about the safeguarding measures that church takes, and do all churches have a designated safeguarding lead? I think their fear was, like, you know, if you're a person that wants to abuse children, for example, besides a school, a church is a really good place to have access to children. And this idea of trusting people simply because they're Christians, and that must mean that they're good people, feels quite dangerous, actually. And I felt very defensive of church, and I was like, but church was great for me as a kid, and I had all these amazing adults, and this person that I was with was like, yeah, it was great for you. You know, other children and young people didn't have the same experience.
It's tough, isn't it? Because it feels like a subset of the sort of not all men
I know
conversation. But it's enough men. And when I talk to men about the not all men thing, I say, let's say you're walking along the street late at night and there's a gang of teenage boys just being a bit loud and Larry, what do you say to yourself at that point? Do you say, well, not every gang of teenage boys is going to provoke me and prod me and maybe try and take my wallet or my phone or whatever? No, there's something deep within you that makes you suddenly become afraid and anxious and you start thinking about your safety. It's enough, men, that it's an automatic and natural response to become aware of your need for safety. And I think what we're learning is that if the church is harming enough people, that it's becoming part of our national awareness. That is this a safe place to be? Now, Charlotte and I are in the same church. It's a small church. And for a small church, having a working safeguarding policy is just the biggest ball ache possible. Sorry for the gendered language, but it is part of our commitment to being the kind of community that we want to be. And so I would say to your friends, absolutely, if the church can't talk about how people are kept safe in very practical ways, and this is what we do, and this is who you could talk to, then I would be wary.
I think there's a level of, like, I don't know, I don't want to use the word naivety, but kind of almost trusting people because of like the title that they have or the beliefs that they hold.
Yeah.
And I think what you said earlier, Charlotte, about, people saying, oh, but I've had a really good experience of them, or, oh, well, they've really helped me on my spiritual journey. So what you're saying can't be true or actually isn't important because you're the only person saying it.
Yeah, and we see that a lot. Like, it's really difficult for victims to come forward in churches, particularly because you know that your experience with this person is different from maybe 200 people in the room, 1,000 people in the room. If we're talking about Hillsongs, we're talking about 15,000 people in a room who love the guy on stage, and you've got to be the person to say, this is my experience of this person, and everybody else will say that can't be the case because he speaks so beautifully, he preaches so well, he talks about the love of God so wonderfully, he, like all of those things make it really difficult for victims in churches to speak out, make it really difficult for safeguarding procedures and investigations to be done well. And again, I will constantly come back to the need for really good, robust policies. Because for investigations to be done well in a place where we all know each other, again, one of the differences between a church and a school is that if a teacher we can just remove the teacher from the school. Remove them.
Yeah.
Like, we take them out while the investigation's happening. They're not there. Off they go. Like, most people won't have contact with that teacher outside of that space. But in a church, our relationships are so intertwined, it can be very, very difficult. And without like really clear rules about how this is going to work, it's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult even with those rules, right? So if you don't have them, if you don't have a good policy, if you don't have structures in place to quickly move in and do something and investigate well, then it's so muddy. And people will be, quite often, you feel like you are betraying a friend, and you're betraying everybody else's friends. And like, it's all of those really, it's emotional anyway in any other situation. In a church, some of these things just are like way more difficult. Because it's difficult, like, I'm pretty sure, to be very frivolous at Revive, it's probably quite hard to say to anyone, I just really hate the way Charlotte preaches, right? If you really hate the way I teach, it's difficult because it might get back to me because we're only 35 people. Or everyone will tell you you're being horrible because they like me. Like, if you think about the power that I have, just being the person with the microphone, not that we have a microphone because we're in people's houses, but, like, how difficult would it be then to say, I think she's treating me badly. Like, those sorts of close relationships, it's a really important thing. We had Natalie Collins, who's a campaigner about sexual violence and abuse. She's written a great book called Out of Control, Come and Talk to Revive, about domestic abuse and how that turns up in church and how we deal with that, which is quite similar. But she was saying, like, there is a problem with, we don't want to feel that we're the sorts of people who can be taken in by abusers. It's the same reaction we all have to being scammed in some way. Like, we don't want to believe we're that person, that somebody could pull the wool over our eyes. Especially in churches, we like to think that we are like emotionally intelligent and that we're good judges of character and that this is a thing that we do. When someone accuses somebody of abuse, the immediate thing is, A, you want to defend your friend, but also you're partly defending yourself, the bit in your heart that knows that you don't trust bad people. You are only friends with good people. And that is really difficult. Like I say, we see it with the domestic abuse a lot. It's very hard to believe that the person who's been a really good friend to you can be a really horrible partner, even though they're two different situations. And so churches also kind of need, when these things happen, to admit some of that, to admit that partly we don't want to believe it, that there's emotional work to go through as a community, that we need to do the work afterwards to say, yes, somebody can say beautiful things to you that really affect your life and also do awful things. And how do we process that together instead of just always shoving it off and going, well, they were bad and we've done that now?
Well, I was just going to say, if there are folk listening from churches or other institutions, that there's a tendency to say, well, we have a safeguarding officer. And if you've got a story to tell, we're ready to hear it. There is so much that we need to help people overcome. And, you were saying earlier, well, it might be one person in 15,000. If it's one person in 15,000, it's probably 50 people in
That's true.
15,000.
Yeah, absolutely.
But each one thinks that they're one in 15,000. So they have to overcome the shame and they have to overcome this idea that they as an individual are going to destroy God's work.
Yep.
So it's really, really important for the institution to try and lower all of these hurdles as much as they can. So I don't think it's enough to just say there's a sheet of paper on the wall with a telephone number. We have to actively say, we really want to hear these stories. I had a friend come to me, working in a church where she felt that her boss, who was the minister, was just making her feel really, really uncomfortable. And she didn't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
And I said, well, they are an accredited minister. I mean, that does mean something within our denomination, which is the Baptist denomination, which is, even if all you want to do is write it down, that these things happen and it was ambiguous, but you felt really uncomfortable, then that can at least go on a file. And if you're the only person, that's fine. But if there are 3 or 4 other people that have done the same thing as you, then the institution needs to know that.
It's about building that bigger picture up, isn't it?
Yeah. And that isolation, like you say, is really, everybody does think they're alone. And I think we do need to talk about safeguarding more. No, so in the Baptist Union, there is a requirement for you to do safeguarding level 1 with your church once a year. Most churches that I know, I could be wrong, and I'd love people to tell us what their best practice is. But my experience in churches up till in the last 20 years is that when there's this sort of like once a year safeguarding video, you do it in the meeting, it's about 3 minutes long, and then you've done it, And that's that's where we're at, is this like, we do it once a year. And I think we have to start thinking in the way that I'm thinking about, like, how do I teach in my classroom? I'm the president of an academic society. How do I make the conferences safe? I think these things have to be talked about more out loud all year, Read your safeguarding policy, or at least, most of us have the full safeguarding policy and then an A4 safeguarding policy, right? Like an A4 sheet. Read it out every month. This is who you go to, guys. It's this person over here is our safeguarding officer. If you want to report something, there they are. This is what will happen when you report, because it's really important people know. Victims need to know how safe they are. And one of the ways you judge whether you're safe is by what's going to happen once I tell someone. Because you don't want to end up in a situation like I talked about on the podcast, where in saying that something was wrong, I end up put in a room with this guy and told to tell him what I think he did wrong. Like, I will never put myself in that situation again. So I need to know what's going to happen next. Like those. But I think we do. I think it needs to be much more on the surface. Because also then it's like, Rachel's talking about her friends taking kids to church. If you walked into a church and one of the things they did in their like notices, as well as saying like, if you want prayer, this is who you go to, said, and we're really aware that like none of us are perfect and things happen here and there's power dynamics at play. And so if you think anything's off, here's who you go and talk to. We're really up for that conversation. Here we are, you'd go, oh. And I think we always think that sounds like we're saying something's wrong here, so we have to have this. But I think we just need to change that narrative, that actually people who are safe talk about safety and how they make people safe. That's what safe, that's it. And we do know actually that when it comes to abuse, that abusers, particularly when we're talking about the sorts of abuse that is an abuser grooming people, or an abuser going, where's a situation that I can abuse, that I can manipulate? Abuse happens less when it's talked about more, not the other way around. The more you talk about it, the harder, because the more everyone in your church knows the signs of a groomer, or knows what to look out for in a young person that's being abused, or knows what to look out for in a relationship that's abusive, the harder it is for someone to abuse those boundaries. The easier it is for them to be picked up really early, I
was going to say, we have had a question about, are there any indicators that a supportive and encouraging pastoral relationship has tipped over into grooming, and what they are?
Yeah, yes. There are resources that lay this stuff out So one of the things that is really difficult, particularly it always with domestic abuse and clergy abuse, these kind of like close, intimate, violent relationships, is that what in one sense is a really caring person, in another sense can be a really controlling person. You know, the boyfriend that wants to pick you up from the train station to make sure you get home safe, really caring and lovely. The boyfriend that won't ever let you walk home alone and never wants you to be out of his sight, controlling. But when that flips is a really difficult thing to observe. And people who are groomers, and all abusers tend to groom those around them, use that fact that things that are caring can be manipulated into control. And they will establish and they will groom those around them as well. So sometimes I say we worry that we didn't see the signs. How did we not see the signs? Well, one of the reasons is an abuser is also grooming you. They are making sure that you think a particular way about them. So one of the things is we need to pay attention to the different ways that people are vulnerable in our congregations. So abusers will always go for someone who's vulnerable in some way, because that's a thing. So that can be as basic as they're just the person that is always alone with them in the office, right? That's a vulnerability. Even if they're surrounded by friends and family, they've got a lot of time alone with a person. So we need to make sure that we're checking in, that things are appropriate, that boundaries are in place. But it could also be marginalization. So somebody who is alone a lot, somebody who doesn't have family in the church, someone who doesn't have, things like that. Quite a lot of victims of people, one of the things in the Ravi Zacharias scandal was that she was a married woman, and everyone's a bit like, how does that happen? But we work our people hard with long hours, right? So we've made it a culture that is normal for people to put their family aside to do the work of God. And we need to think about some of those things, because it's how does someone isolate someone? So the other thing is they'll always build trust, and they will establish a connection and make someone feel like they are special and that the job they do for them, only they can do. So we want to be observing where a minister or a worship leader has a one-on-one relationship with someone and they start making them the special person that can only work with them. And we saw that in the Mike Pilavachi report. If you look at that, that's a lot of what that happens, is that one particular person gets all of the attention, all of the praise, kind of they become the partner in ministry without kind of proper boundaries around it. They quite often will make that person feel like they're the one that's initiating this, or they've got all the power in it. So if someone's talking to you and they're saying, but the thing is they need me, like they've told me so much that they need me to do the work. So I know I'm spending a lot of time with them. They've told me they need me, because abusers like to make the victim look like it was their initiation and it was their contact. So that's another thing that we want to be looking out for, is the power is with the person with the microphone or the guitar or the youth leader. That that's the case. We need to not forget that, because abusers quite often talk about themselves as people who are powerless. If you go and look at lots of abusers, particularly clergy, sexual abusers, apologies, in inverted commas, they will talk about how they felt like someone without any power, and they're just a man and they're just a person and they're not really anything, and this relationship was just special or whatever. No, let's always keep in mind that they have the power, like they just do. And we forget that. We believe them, because also we value humility. So we see it as humility, but it's not, it's manipulation. We need church leaders who admit what their power is these days. I think that's a thing. We really need to all start being honest with ourselves about what power we have and how we use it. And again, the more that we do that, the harder it is for someone who wants to flip that script to do it, because those of us who are hopefully good, caring, kind people will be saying, I still have power here and I need to manage that.
I went to an academic conference and I had the fun job of summing up at the end of the conference with a couple of other people. And this was a conference almost exclusively for Anglican church planters. So they were mainly, not exclusively, but they were mainly young men from charismatic and evangelical backgrounds, and they were wanting to do new forms of church. And this wasn't remotely on topic, but I took the opportunity to say to them, statistically speaking, you people here in the room are probably the most likely to abuse people in your church. of any kind of room full of clergy.
Yeah.
Because you've got the authority of Anglican priesthood and you've got the novelty of doing something new where lines of accountability are not clear. And if it goes well, nobody will want to question what you're doing. They don't like to mess around with things that are successful. And just let that sit. Because if you're sitting here thinking, oh, well, that I'm not going to do that, then you're the biggest problem.
Yeah.
Because I think we are talking now. I mean, I'm an amateur. I make it absolutely clear, but we are talking about certain kinds of personality.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you look at Chris Brain from the 9 o'clock service, I think you're talking about a very strong power dynamic, someone who got pleasure and satisfaction from abusing people,
Mm-hmm.
you know, from genuinely controlling people. I think it's more often someone with unmet needs who feels that they somehow deserve love and affection and that this isn't abuse at all. This is, you know, this is a good thing and their person wanted it. And I'm just this terrible victim, you know, of my own desires. And this person came into my life and they, you know, they exploited my weaknesses. It's a completely daft narrative, but unfortunately I've heard it
Yeah. I mean, I would
too
say,
often.
yeah. And I would say that the more I talk to friends who have been in abusive situations that are like this or have been through it, literally we will have the conversation where we'll say, is there just a playbook that these guys read? Because we all have the same pattern. And it's not always conscious. I do believe that. So I think, again, it's why it's important to distinguish sometimes between adult clergy sexual abuse and child clergy sexual abuse, because there are distinct things that we know that paedophiles do to gain access to certain communities and things. But with adult sexual abuse and coercive control, because clergy sexual abuse is coercive control, sometimes it gets sexual, sometimes it doesn't. And you might still feel like you have been in a coercive controlling relationship and that is still clergy abuse. That's not something we should be okay with. It's not just if something sexual happens that this is a problem. There are patterns, and like what you described there, Simon, is a really interesting narrative, because it's the narrative we see in the apologies of these people over and over again. Weakness, didn't mean to, you know, this person was in my space and I couldn't resist, kind of all of those kind of things. What's really difficult is one of the places that church has to be really careful is that we hand them. If you think of all the things that we've discussed over the last however many episodes it's been now, one of the things that church teaching on sex is hands these people, particularly if they are men, hands them a narrative that says this isn't really your fault. That if you're working for the Lord and you're working really long hours and you just are in that room all the time with that person, then really your lust is the thing that took over, that it's not you. This is just a feature of the sin in the world, kind of all of those things. Like, we hand that narrative. We also hand it to abusers, and abusers use it. So in clergy sexual abuse cases, we see a lot of abusers using that narrative to also enact coercive control on the people that they're with. They couldn't resist it. They don't want it. They're trying to fight it, but they couldn't, you know, like, and again, one of the ways of identifying it, if somebody is talking to you about the relationship that they are having with a person in leadership and they're using that sort of language and they're saying to you, oh, well, he's just really struggling and he's really weak and we just feel really drawn together. And like, that should be a red flag for us. Like I said at the podcast, sometimes people have affairs where, you know, that is a thing that happens, but it's enough of a red flag. Like, let's start planting red flags where they are, you know, and going like, I'm going to ask some further questions. I'm going to report this. Like you say, I'm going to write it down. I'm going to tell the safeguarding person that I think that this relationship is off and can we just keep an eye on it? And if the red flag is nothing, you can take it down later. I think we need to be less nervous of raising red flags, because if it isn't anything, then hopefully we can sort that out.
I was going to say, we have had a query about false allegations. And
yeah,
I think the phrase that Tim used when he was kind of querying this was like, you know, protecting good people in, you know, quotes from false allegations. And I think that is a very real thing that adults working with children and young people and, adults working with vulnerable adults have to consider is, there is an element of risk in that. Dad, I don't know if you want to take this one.
One of the nice things that people say about this podcast is that people are being brave. It's probably brave to say that I was once threatened with an allegation of sexual abuse. I don't want to go into the details.
No.
I was sent a text message saying, I am going to say these things about you. This was someone who was very, very upset with me and wanted me to hurt like they were hurting at that time. And I remember sitting down with you, Rachel, and your brother and sister and saying, if this person follows through, this is what is going to happen. I was working for 2 churches at the time. I will be suspended from both of the churches while this is investigated. So a bit like your example of a teacher. Because I'm an accredited minister, there's a formal process and it might take some time. And I realize even in telling you this, I'm asking you to trust me when I say this is what I think is going on. In the end, it didn't come to anything, but I had to alert, my accrediting body, this might be coming. We just need to prepare for what will happen. Will it affect both churches? Because it was someone connected to one of the 2 churches. So I know that feeling, and I know that kind of no smoke without fire thing, that it may well have harmed my reputation and therefore my ability to serve in a church. But I mean, honestly, that harm to me it's not really comparable to the harm of an abuser. It helped that obviously I knew that what was being alleged was not true. And there wasn't a great deal of ambiguity about it. I was confident of how things would progress if the accusation was made. I feel like this, if I'm being completely honest, I think it does happen. I'm aware. Anna, my wife, makes films about child sexual abuse, and we watched a documentary together about an individual who made claims about being a victim of child sexual abuse that were provably false. And it's a really, really difficult situation, but I would rather people come forward with false claims that can be properly investigated. I suspect it's like rape in that not enough people come forward, and even of those that do come forward, there's not enough evidence to always prove what's happened. So as a clergy person, I'm not going to pretend it's not really difficult, and it may well have harmed me, but I would rather be in a position where people can come forward than that they can't.
It's a really difficult thing because obviously, like you say, I generally, my stance on these things is that I believe people when they come forward, because I spent too many years not being believed and not believing people. And that means that, your first instance, and most safeguarding policies are, the thing is we believe the person and we act as though this is true until we know it isn't true, because the harm done by not believing and allowing someone who is an abuser to stay at the front of church, control the narrative, do all of those things is so much greater than the worry of removing somebody. But obviously for that individual, I can only imagine that is horrible and terrifying. It doesn't happen very often compared to the amount of people who are abused, as you say. Like, we know this, that false allegations are very few and far between. One of the points of a good, robust safeguarding policy, though, and talking about it and changing the culture in your church to be something where it's very hard for secrecy to be a thing, for secret relationships to happen, etc., is that then it's very hard for someone to accuse you because everything is written down, documented, visible, Like, I think I was taught as a youth worker that the rules I had to obey in safeguarding were as much for me as they were for the young person. And they weren't even talking about young people falsely accusing, but they were just like, say you drive someone home from youth group and you're sat in the car talking outside a house and that kid is in the front of the car. It's really going to be really hard for you to claim that you were just dropping them off And if somebody decided to say that they saw you and it was something dodgy going on, if they're in the back, if you're never alone in a car with a young person, which was the rule, I'm never on my own. And if I do take young people, they sit in the back and I'm in the front, then it's quite easy to say, no, this is what was happening. If you take a photo of it, like this is the dynamic. It's, my friend works in a church and first thing he did moved into his new office was put a window in the door. So he's never alone in that office. Everyone can always see what's happening. They can always look inside. They can see what's on his computer. That's not because he's worried. It's because it keeps him safe.
I think what you're talking about is transparency, right? Literally, giving the ability for other people to look in on a situation and understand. And I remember my youth worker, I absolutely adored her. And she was probably mid-20s and I would have been, 15. So I just thought she was the bee's knees. And because of my walking disability, I can get knocked off guard very easily. And I remember a time where she hugged me goodbye from, we'd come back from a trip or something. And she hugged me goodbye and we fell over and she fell on top of me. And I thought the whole thing was really funny. And I was like, oh no, and that was my own kind of physical, I literally just fell after having kind of been knocked into. And I remember her talking to me about it a week later. And saying we're not allowed to do that anymore. And when, I've been told that I'm not allowed to, hug you anymore. And I don't blame her for this at all, but I was then really confused. And I think what would have been helpful for me as a young person in that situation is the transparency of somebody just saying, because, our body's touched in such a way, or it looked like this, or whatever you need to say. And actually the bluntness of that and the transparency of that, and just saying, well, I don't have anything to hide, so I'm going to put a window in the door, would have been really helpful.
Rachel, I do have a question for you as a former social worker. Because obviously you get to see the most problematic situations where trust has been exploited and people have been abused. Because I think the difficulty with churches is it's not like school, it's not like family, it's somewhere in between. That it is a legal institution, but it's very relational. Ideally, you want it to be about relationships. You want people to have a degree of intimacy and informality that you wouldn't have in a school setting. And there are lots of churches around the UK like Revive, which are more informal, based in homes. And there's a real struggle there for how you organise in a way that is true to the sort of relationality of the community, but still keeps people safe. I'm curious for you, having grown up in a community like that and having been a social, whether you have seen anything that's good or bad, or whether you have any wisdom for people. And I'm sad that your youth worker had to say that, but I kind of understand it at the same time. We had a rule that you never hug a young person, but you don't stop a young person from hugging you. But so you're caught in the middle, I think. And so but you have this expertise in safeguarding. So I just wondered if you have anything that you would put into the mix from your expertise. You've come from a hard legal background as working as a social worker. It's just is there any flexibility when you're in a church for this is God's family?
I think I have lots of thoughts. I don't want people to be dissuaded from trusting, because I think trust in and of itself is a good thing. And I was thinking when you were speaking earlier, Dad, the person that made those allegations against you, I spent time with alone, one-on-one, and thought that they were a nice person and a good person. And, looking back on it, I actually wasn't quite sure why they invested in me in that way, but they did. And I kind of potentially naively just had this well, my parents trust them, so I trust them. And I think it's good to trust. And it was helpful for me to learn to trust other adults that weren't my parents. And I think that is important. And it was really important for me and for you guys as my parents to know that. There was one example where I was a teenager where I'd told another adult in the church about me self-harming, and they immediately shared that with you. And they told me that that's what they were going to do. And they said, thank you for telling me this. I'm going to tell your parents. And I was absolutely furious because I didn't understand why that had happened. But I think it was really important that that person was there because I felt that I could tell them that. And then it meant that my parents knew that. I think from the safeguarding perspective of social work, that is very regimented because it has to be, but it's also very informal in some regards because you are walking into people's living rooms. And I think the thing that I was thinking about when you were talking is there is an idea of this thing called contextual safeguarding. So looking at where abuse happens. And you referred specifically to the church building. So, if your church isn't taking place in a building, where is it taking place? And doing that step of what you did there of like, okay, where is the bathroom? And who is going to be there? And how many adults are there in comparison to children? And this idea of contextual safeguarding is essentially like literally blocking it out and going, well, the lady that kind of came up with this idea, she was talking about a school where kind of significant number of girls in the school were talking about being groped and assaulted in a very specific corridor. And it was like stairs, and there was no kind of classrooms. There was like a window, but it was kind of a very secluded part of the school. And thinking about it in that sense of, nobody thought that that would happen there. And thinking about things not at face value is really important. And for me, like the legal side of working in social care, there were very clear boundaries there for me as a professional. And when you're in church community, you are among friends, you're among family, and that is significantly trickier. Whereas when I was a professional, I didn't have any personal ties to these people, and I could go in and say, this is wrong, you need to do this. And, what you were talking earlier about, Charlotte, is those people would try and manipulate me because they wanted me to think that they were getting better. Like I remember working with one dad who was single parenting his kids, and he would get drunk and XYZ would happen. And he would literally bring out all of his like alcohol-free beer that he'd bought to show me and be like, look, I'm not drinking. Here's all my alcohol-free beer. And I'm like, okay, well, just because it's there doesn't mean that you're not drinking actual alcohol. And I think I didn't walk into a church building expected to be manipulated, but I would walk into a home visit as a social worker expecting them to do everything that they can to put their best foot forward to me as a professional that in some regards has the legal power to remove their children. So I find it tricky because I don't want to look at church in the same way, and I don't want to look at church as okay, I've got to go in and go, I don't really know anybody and I can't really trust anybody, and that is the wrong thing. But I think the thing I'm going back to is transparency and having that regularity of here's our safeguarding policy, here's our procedure, here's the person. And we've talked about shame a couple of times, and we've actually talked about shame loads in this podcast, but what does that feel like in that church community for that person? How do we help them not feel ashamed when something does happen and they do want to tell somebody, and when they do tell someone, what happens after that is all really important. I don't know if I've answered your question necessarily.
I'm really I'm excited by the phrase contextual safeguarding. As the person who writes the safeguarding policy for Revive, for context for people, Revive meets in people's homes. We're very small. We're maybe 35 adults, maybe 50 people, depending on where you draw the boundaries of what is Revive, which is part of the problem of writing a safeguarding policy, is what counts as a Revive activity and what doesn't. Legally, that's different in my head to practically what happens as Revive, right? And I describe our policy as expansive because I just think, and I think this is partly to do with how churches think about safeguarding, is we also think about it as the responsibility of the youth worker, the minister, the safeguarding person. And I think what we're actually talking about is a change in church culture where we all consider these things. And maybe the phrase safeguarding isn't helpful because it now has so much baggage that people find it constrictive and annoying. But what I'm talking about always is we say we want to be people who care for one another, who are built on these values of protecting the vulnerable and loving our neighbour and all those things. How do we do that together? How do we, as a group of people? And one of the ways for me is I'm trying to get everybody, as many people as possible, to take the safeguarding training, the level 2 and 3 training. I want everyone to do it in church because any of our adults might be a trusted adult, not just the youth worker, because we're always in things together, like we don't have a distinct youth work. I want us to take responsibility as grown-ups of faith for our power and how we do things. I want it to be this conversation that is much more about like, who are you and how do you act in your community? And are you watching out for each other in these ways? Here's what coercive control looks like. I also want people to be a little bit gracious with their minister. If I say to you, we need to have coffee outside of my house because I'm single, I live alone, don't be upset with me, which has happened, because you think I see this as work and not friendship. Because I'm never not the minister of Revive. I'm always the minister, whether we're on the clock or not. So I might just think, do you know what? It is better for us. I know we're going to talk about really emotional things today. Let's just not be in my house. Like you say, it's transparency. Be honest. I can't meet with you in the house because safeguarding and we need to make sure, and that's how I'm caring for both of us today. Is that all right? And say yes. I want to be expansive and I want it to be about all of us together and not imposed structures, even though we still need all those legal things. And let's talk about boundaries. Let's talk about power. Like, I know I keep saying we all need to take responsibility for our power. It's a bit of a broken record, but it is really important.
I think one of the things that just popped into my head while you were talking, Charlotte, is I just had that question of like asking each other what would help us trust. What will help us trust each other, and what will help parents trust each other with their children. What will help that person trust you, even though you've set a boundary there and said, I will feel better about this situation if this does not take place in my home. These are the reasons why, and we can go into that. But, if this is not going to take place in my house, what will help you trust me with this information? Where do you feel comfortable? If it can't be here, where would you like to go? And asking each other kind of, what would you like to happen? And actually, what are the things that would make us uncomfortable? And going back to what Dad said earlier, like, I don't want anybody to take my child to the toilet that isn't me. That's my boundary. And, how do we help each other as church communities where there is a lot of broken trust? How do we help each other trust? And that, people will butt heads and people will have different ideas. But I think that feels like, I don't know, if I was going to orchestrate that conversation, that might be a helpful place to start.
I think that's great.
Dad, at the end of the last episode, you talked about writing to your MP about the law. But I believe since we did that, things have changed.
Well, it's slightly more embarrassing than that, in that since we did that about a year ago, I realised that the law had already been changed and I didn't know it. So I was referring to the 2003 Sexual Offences Act, which specifically excluded church leaders from this idea of trusted adults in sexual relationships with young people 16 to 18. So if you were a teacher, for example, you were automatically committing sexual abuse if you're in a relationship with a young person who's technically old enough to give consent. But unbeknownst to me, in 2023, the Act was amended to include clergy and so-called religious instructors, which would include, youth ministers and things like that. So there is equality now under the law that church leaders are not excluded. There's an ongoing conversation about whether religious abuse or religious sexual abuse needs a legal definition.
Yeah.
That's a separate conversation. So the thing that I was campaigning for and saying, let's all write to our MPs, that's already happened.
Clarification, though, it's clergy sexual abuse can only be defined in court, right? If you manage to get it all the way through and someone says this was abusive. If you're allowed to just have a relationship with one of your parishioners.
Yes.
And even though I would say that's not okay because you're not allowed to be in a relationship with your therapist or your doctor.
Yes,
we don't have guidelines about that.
Although that's normally around professional guidelines rather than a therapist might lose their accreditation if they have a relationship with a client.
Okay.
There are various rules around that in different church organizations.
Yeah.
But clearly there's a big problem in new non-denominational churches that don't have any accreditation structures. So when such a relationship happens, there's no formal suspension or disbarment or anything. That's the point where this kind of abusive, it's your job to forgive, all of that becomes problematic. I think it's a really interesting conversation to have. At the moment, the current government are talking about creating a legal definition of honour-based abuse, which would then become an aggravating factor in other criminal abuse cases.
Yeah.
I think there's an argument to say that abuse by a person in authority should be legally defined so that it becomes an aggravating factor in sexual abuse cases.
And it's important that's why we've got this coercive control law now, which is also important, right? In relationships, is that you can be done for coercive control as much as anything else. And we do see that. So
thank you so much for listening, everybody. I'm very excited because the next episode that is coming out, I feel like I named, or at least I'm being told that I named. And the episode is called Christians Should Just Have a Wank. So I'm going to leave you with that, and we'll see you next time.
Good attempt, Rachel. The episode is actually slightly more tentatively titled, Do Christians Just Need a Good Wank? And you can listen to that in a few weeks' time on Monday 16th of February. We also have news of a live event. On Thursday 12th of March, we're joined by Reverend Dr. Helen Painter for a session on Christianity and the far right. If you live anywhere around Leeds, UK, then keep an eye out on our socials or subscribe to our Substack for more details. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And a reminder, if you'd like to support the project, make sure you share it widely, and you can patronise us by subscribing to agodwecouldbelievin.substack.com. Here you'll also receive bonus episodes and regular reflections from Simon and the team right to your inbox. We'll see you again very soon.